All right, we're getting ready to talk about gardening. Welcome, everybody. This is going to be a fun one. This is going to be a fast-paced hour, I think. I have my water. Hopefully, everybody who is speaking has their water.
Stay hydrated, like the plants.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to wait until about 2 minutes after. It looks like people are still piling in. Okay. Well, for me, I show that it's 11:02 Central Time, so it's 2 minutes after the hour. And we're going to get underway with Victory Garden Tips for Beginners. And before I introduce our panelists, what I want to do is talk about National Garden Bureau and this whole Victory Garden thing. So, National Garden Bureau is a 92-year-old organization. We were founded by Mr. James Burdett. That's him there in the lower right side. And he wrote the original Victory Garden Manual in the 1940s. So during the pandemic, we at National Garden Bureau kind of revived the whole concept of Victory Garden. We called it Victory Garden 2.0, and we did a whole series of blogs. But the whole concept here is to help new gardeners. And so we wanted to do this webinar to go along with that. And luckily today we have two of our expert members here. We are a membership-based organization. We have Sam Schmitz from Ball Horticultural Company, and we have Katie Rotella from Ball Horticultural Company. And my name is Diane Blazik. I'm the Executive Director for National Garden Bureau. And we also have Gail, who has her video off. Oh, there she is. Gail is on. So Gail helps us tremendously behind the scenes with webinars, blogs, social media marketing, and everything else. So Katie and Sam, why don't you guys do a quick introduction of yourself and then we'll get into this.
Sure, sounds great. Good morning, everybody. Happy to co-host you with Diane and the team. I have been with Ball Horticultural Company for a little over 12 years now. When I started, I was not necessarily an avid gardener, but working for a company like Ball, it actually gets in your blood and you dream about plants after a while. So I am the public relations and digital manager here. So my job is to share brand new plants to the industry and to gardeners across North America. And it's one of my favorite things to do is to tour people in the gardens at Ball here in West Chicago, Illinois. So I'll be speaking to you today from my experiences, hits and misses, what I know about the plants that I help share, as well as from my Zone 5 Midwest kind of garden experience. And I'm pleased to be joined by Sam Schmitz.
Hey, yeah, that would be me. So I've been with Ball now for 14 years, I believe, somewhere in there. And I'm the grounds guy. If it's green and it's outside a building, I probably have my hands on it at some point in time. I also do the bulk of the garden bed design every season with plant selection, the color choices, all that kind of fun stuff that goes along with it. I've also been an All-American Selections vegetable judge for 8, 9, 10 years, somewhere in there.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact, it's been a while. So my experience is more with the finished product, things like that, but I've been involved in this industry for my entire life. I went to University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana for ornamental horticulture, stayed and did a master's in turf management, and have been in the landscape industry and growing side of things now for the better part of 20 years. So even though I'm not a full-on greenhouse person, I have had my fair share of experience growing from a commercial standpoint, so I can add some insights from the growing side of things, from the commercial side, and then successes in the gardens, how to start things, when to transplant, those kind of details. So yeah, this should be fun.
That sounds wonderful. We are in a meeting format for Zoom, so I was going to tell everybody that if you put your Zoom on speaker view, so then you will see the person who is speaking up to the in the corner of the presentation that I'm doing, and I'm sure there are going to be questions. We've gotten some questions prior to this, as well as some of the questions that you can put in the chat, and we will get to those. And let's see here. Now, I think what we'll do is we'll get started here. I mentioned our blog series that we did, which is all on our website, ngb.org. And what I gave this actual presentation out in Seattle about a month ago. And what I wanted to remind new gardeners that it is okay to make a mistake. I'm sure Katie and Sam and Gail and everybody is like, yeah, we've all made mistakes. In fact, that's how we learn. So that's kind of our mantra for today and probably for a lifetime of gardening is it's okay to make a mistake because that's how you learn. And so we will jump right in here. And, a lot of these tips are really geared to people who maybe just in the last year or two have started to garden or they see their friends gardening, so now they want to. And I think it's important to think about what kind of garden you want. And, maybe you just want to start with one or two patio containers, or maybe you've moved into a new house and you have a whole acre or two to plant. So Katie and Sam, you can chime in here. Is there anything else you want to add here when you're thinking about what kind of garden you want?
I'd like to jump in first and make sure, one of the biggest things, and you'll see towards the end, like the advice from the experts is when you're just starting out, it's okay to start small because little successes here and there build up your confidence. If you have a mistake, it's easy to correct. If you go right in and say, hey, I want a massive, expansive vegetable patch, but then you realize I don't really have time to weed and harvest and maintain this garden, and then you're unsuccessful, you're not going to come back the next year. You're going to feel like you failed. So I like beginners to start small. And even if that's a 4x6 plot, if you need to grow in the ground, or choose a little section of your garden that gets a sunny location and be really successful with a couple plants there. Containers are amazing because you can move them around. You can, they're manageable with a watering can as opposed to, dragging the hose. And I think you definitely want to feel the confidence of a big win your first couple of years out by being appropriate in the size that you choose, for sure.
And to add to that a little bit, figuring out what type of garden you want, super important. You also have to keep in mind where you're going to put that garden and where you are in the country. I noticed we have people from all over the place. If you wanted to try to grow, say, big watermelon in northern Minnesota, you might not have a long enough growing season to actually produce them. If you want to grow broccoli in Salt Lake City, you might be too hot in the summer. If you want to grow vegetables in general, but you have a shady backyard, might not work. So figuring out what type of garden you want, super important. Figuring out what those plants, what they need, will help you be successful as well. And anybody at your local garden centers, places like that, they will know the answers to those questions, what zone you're in, what works well, the length of your growing season. They'll be able to help you with that. So don't be afraid to ask questions. We, as horticulture people, love when people ask questions because anytime we can give them more information, it just helps us in the long run.
I think you stole the thunder of one of my later slides, Sam, but that's quite all right. But it was such a perfect segue. So the growing zone, which Sam, you were exactly going there, is talking about, you have to know your growing zone. You can see that I put in here, Seattle Tacoma is 8A or B, but you can go actually to the front page of the NGB website, and we've got a link right there to the USDA growing zones. All you have to do is enter your zip code, and that will tell you what your growing zone is. And Katie mentioned, and Sam and I were all three in a zone 5 growing zone, or a zone 5 USDA zone. So yeah, that to me is very important so that your expectations are in reality. So then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about soil. And so I'm going to toss this back, I think, to Sam first, and then Katie, you can chime in. But Sam, let's talk about dirt.
Yeah, also super important. Being in the Midwest, typically, if we're in undisturbed soil, we have a nice, deep, rich, kind of a clay loam. Sometimes it's more of, we're really not silty ever. Or let me rephrase, we're not sandy ever. We might be silty. which is the one that's not mentioned there. Silt is just tiny organic matter that builds up over time, usually washing out of rivers, floodplains. But yeah, knowing your soil type, super important. Most plants like to be slightly acidic. The pH scale 0 to 14, 7 is right in the middle, neutral pH. 6.5 is about where most plants like to be. That's important. That's the acidic or alkaline. Blueberries like to be high. They just like a high pH. And the soils, the type of soil that you have will actually play into the amount of nutrients that can be held in that soil, the type of nutrients that are held, and then some of the effects that we'll have on plant growth in terms of their root systems, their stability, just how far they can spread, how much heat and how much moisture is held in the soil. So how often you have to water, how hot the soils get in the spring, how quickly they heat up. So those types of things are important. There
So
are.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
What I was going to ask is, okay, so if I'm a beginning gardener and I've never even dug in my backyard, how do I know what kind of soil I have? Do I go to my local extension office, local garden center? Do I ask my neighbor? What do you recommend?
The extension offices are a really good resource. They really help. There are U.S. Geological Survey maps that map out almost all of the soil types. They are a bear to try to read.
Yeah.
For someone who doesn't really know what they're looking at, they're a pain. For someone who does, they're still a pain. They're just hard to read. There's a lot of techno jargon in them. Doesn't make a lot of sense. The extension offices could give you a pretty good idea. If you've never had this done before, good. Soil amendments, soil tests, cover crops. I was just going to mention all that. So if you've never gardened before and if you're in containers, easy. You buy a decent potting mix, no problem. If you're in a sandy soil and it's sandy, you pick it up, it runs through your fingers, it feels like sand. Usually you're okay. When you get some of the heavier some soils, some with more compost, organic matter, the clays, the silts, those can get tricky. And I'm glad it mentions a soil test there. Soil tests aren't all that expensive. Usually you take a Ziploc bag, you dig a couple of holes in your backyard, you take a cup of soil from 4 or 5 different spots where you're going to put your vegetable garden, throw it in the bag, label it. You can send it off to get tested. I'm going to ballpark between 25 and 40 bucks for a soil test. On the plus side, you really only have to do it once because soil doesn't change all that quickly.
Right.
But then that soil test will tell you what you have in your soils, the type of soil you have, the amount of nutrients that are in it currently, your percent organic matter, and you could start to get a better idea of, do I have a decent soil? Is it too compacted? Is it missing something? Is it really, really low on one of the nutrients I need, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium? Do I have to add more back into it? Or am I okay with just planting, fertilizing over the top, and we'll be okay for the season?
Yeah, I would agree. But if you have a good foundation where your roots are where your plants pull in their hydration, you don't water the leaves of a plant and expect them to soak it in, like a sequoia. They comes from the roots. So knowing your soil and managing that with either, if you're in a container and you've got a great potting mix that holds the moisture, has nice texture to it, it's got maybe a little bit of bark in it, or areas that can hold that moisture or nutrients. When the roots can really dig down deep and form a good foundation, you've got healthier plants right off the bat. It's a really good foundation, is to know that soil. And like Sam said, maybe only once or twice if you've moved to a new location, or you're moving from indoor plant mama outside to I'm going to try gardening outside. It's a good choice to make, to kind of just know what you're dealing with. And then those you can make recommendations in terms of adding a bit of compost and getting the right texture, so that when you form the soil in your hand, that it breaks apart generally easily. If you hold it in your hand and it stays together like Play-Doh, that's not great texture for roots to grow. So you want to make sure you've got a good foundation.
Right. So yeah, soil is a good foundation. We could probably do a whole hour on that, but we
Exactly.
have about 50 slides to get through. So we're going to move on to other tips about planning your space. And I think somebody already mentioned that is make sure that it's close by and convenient, that you have water relatively or readily available, and start small. We definitely talked about that. So then on the next one about knowing when to plant, and this was one of the questions that we got ahead of time, is knowing when to start seed indoors. And we have a couple links for you. I think Gail is going to put a link in the chat, and it's from Johnny's Selected Seeds, and they have a really good seed calculator starter because, you know, we're talking to people all over North America, so we can't sit here and say, oh, today's a good day to start peas or peppers or whatever, because it's very dependent on your last frost date about starting seeds indoors. Same way with direct sowing and planting annuals and edibles. So you need to pay attention to your local. That's why we said earlier about your climate zone. And we have a couple of questions, and I want to go through these fairly quickly. They're about seed starting, and we last year did a whole webinar on seed starting, but we'll address a couple of them. What about damping off for seeds? Would you add cinnamon to the seed starting medium, and how to treat it or prevent it?
So damping off, for those that are unfamiliar with the term, basically it's a phenomenon where your seeds start to germinate, and they start to rot right at the crown where the plant comes out of the soil. The roots start to rot. They rot right at the base, and they kind of just fall over, and they don't make it. Most damping off occurs when the soil is too wet for too long, or the plant is experiencing elevated levels of humidity for too long, where the soil doesn't have an opportunity to dry out, even though you don't put a lot of moisture on it. Just the crown of that plant stays wet for too long. Adding cinnamon probably doesn't do all that much. Diane asked this question before we started, and I started thinking about it a little bit. One of the things that cinnamon might do, it is kind of hydrophilic at times when it gets wet, so it might help to pull some moisture out, but there are better things you could use for that. You can use a lighter soil mix or a lighter potting soil mix so it sheds the excess moisture. You could get a small fan, like you would have like a desk fan, or just a fan that would be in your room, not some big industrial thing, just to get some air movement. Because if the air is moving, it'll have tendency to be drier. It'll wick the moisture out of the soil and keep the root zone and keep the crown of that plant dry, reduce the relative humidity. Because what you want in the root zone for the plant to be healthy is moist but well drained. You don't want excess moisture. So if you can get the soil damp but not wet, that's really what you want to go for. Even when you pick it up and squeeze it in your hands, you shouldn't be able to squeeze moisture and have it drip out. It should kind of crumble, might stick to your palm a little bit, but it shouldn't be so wet that it's like a sponge.
Yeah, you have to remember that your baby plants, I mean, you can see in the picture there, those roots are tiny. Like they don't need massive amounts of moisture to grow at this stage. They just need enough hydration to keep them kind of moving and growing forward. If you've got a full root bound plant at the end of the year and you're going to have to water every day, that's a big drink of water. But right now it's our over love of our seedlings that usually kills them.
Yeah, exactly.
And the roots need oxygen. If there's too much water, they can't breathe. They literally can't get the oxygen they need.
Good point.
Keep the airflow going. We don't recommend sticking it next to your HVAC, like something a little bit separate in an area where good airflow can happen. If you've got it in one of those little greenhouse pieces, maybe take the top off for a while, let the plant breathe. We call it drying down, like letting the plant dry down a bit and then watering, like maybe picking up the tray. If it feels heavy, it's not time to water. Let it sit, let it kind of aspirate from the environment and move that water out.
Okay, great. We got some other questions, but I'm going to save those at the until the end just to make sure we can get through everything. So the next one has to do with the amount of sun per day. And I said know your zone. This is another one, know your space. So you have to understand your building, your yard, where you're situated, how many hours of sun, how far south you are, etc. So I just put some generalizations on here. Full sun would be more than 6 hours a day. Part sun would be between 4 and 6, and full shade would be less than 4 hours. Do you guys want to add any comments there about knowing the amount of sun per day you get on your potential garden area?
I would definitely add in the difference between a morning sun versus an afternoon sun. So afternoon sun is definitely going to be hotter and more intense. So a plant that might need shade but gets a little bit of morning sun is okay. That's a softer moving light, as opposed to, you've all sat on a patio, west facing patio, where you're just dying, right? You're just like, oh my gosh, it's too hot. That's what your plants are feeling as well. So 6 hours a day, but if it's full west facing, that might be too intense for some plants. And just kind of know that area. And if you're growing in a off a balcony, remember, you can't move your building. You're stuck with that space of land. So wherever you're situated on that balcony, just be aware of how that sun is moving across your building. You might end up being a full shade balcony for that reason, even though it's quite bright.
And on that point, with being next to a building or a house or a driveway, just be aware of reflected heat and light. Because even if you're in an area that you might think only gets a few hours of sun a day, if you're right next to a big white wall, the amount of shade you think you're getting might not be what you're getting, because of just the amount of reflected light off of that building, or the amount of heat coming off the driveway, or things like that. So it's just knowing your microclimate of where you're growing.
Good point. And somebody has a question. Does part sun and part shade mean the same thing?
Yeah, pretty much.
I think pretty much, yes.
Yeah, I think they're interchangeable. Yeah. Okay, so now what about this? Planning your space. Now, obviously, this is a nice big garden area, but you see that brick wall in the back. So we were talking about that with knowing your sun, but also you have to know your space. This tip came from the original Victory Garden Manual, and I thought it was very interesting, planting larger plants on the north side and there's smaller ones on the south so that they don't get shaded. Any other good tips there when you're planning your space?
I'll leave it to you, Sam. You're the big designer.
Yeah, I would, on that, just it's plant habit comes into play. So if you have vines, if you have upright plants, typically I don't like putting a lot of vines right next to each other. They grow into each other, and it's really hard to figure out what's what. So I'll separate, say, squash with a row of tomatoes or a row of peppers, and then you put another, some beans that are going to kind of sprawl around, with then something else that's going to be a little bit tight, compact, just to kind of keep things orderly and keep some of those more sprawling crops that have tendency to run away on you, to keep them in check, so that they're not taking over the entire garden space. If you're in a tight spot, if you've got an acre in the back and you can let pumpkins run wild, just let them go.
Good points. Okay, so the next part about planning is exactly that. Containers and raised beds can be a great way to get started. Obviously, containers are super easy. Raised beds might need a little bit more space, but there again, you might be buying the soil to put in there, so you don't have to worry about your soil type. And if you don't want to get down on your hands and knees, a raised bed is a little bit easier. For those of us who are getting older, it might be a little bit easier to do a super high raised bed. What I liked about this photo is it also talks about some of that vertical space, so you can grow vertically. Anything else there? Recommendations when it comes to just kind of thinking about what you have and what you can do for your garden?
I love the permanent structures here, because it's something that even in the wintertime can have some interest. So like this is obviously an early spring. This person's just getting started. It's a lot of patience, because you think, oh, these are just baby plants, but If we were to take this same shot maybe 2 months from now, that trellis is going to be covered. Those vegetables are going to be overflowing, possibly coloring up. So just looking at this contained space, making it feel kind of permanent and more like a structure. It does have that winter interest when you're even looking at something in the springtime that doesn't look too impressive, but with these structures and this layout, you've got something to look at and be proud of as well.
On that too, just be mindful if you're building containers, not so much, but if, well, you need holes in the bottom of the containers. Same thing with raised beds. If you're building them on a surface,
yes,
you have to make sure that whatever you're building that raised bed on, if it's 2 or 3 feet deep, you're okay. These look like they're maybe 8 to 10 inches. If there's no drainage underneath that, what you basically built was a big Tupperware container that you're filling with water. And if it has nowhere to go, you can be very unsuccessful that way because you think water's on, everything looks good at the surface, but the bottom 4 inches of that could be just swimming with water. So if you're going to build a raised bed on a surface, whether it's the dirt in the backyard, place on your patio, make sure the water has somewhere to go out the bottom so that it could still drain even though it's a raised bed.
Great point. Yeah, yeah. Okay, now here's another one, deciding what to plant. Earlier we talked about what kind of garden you want, well, also what to plant. And part of the reason I do this is I've run into so many people that are like, oh, I planted 30 tomato plants and my family doesn't like tomatoes. It's like, well,
right.
Why plant tomato plants? And Sam, I think it might be for you, like, would you plant 30 eggplants? I don't think so. So yeah, that's one of the things I say is, if you're planting and getting the kids involved, ask them what they like to eat or what they might like to try, and don't grow it. I mean, unless you have acres of space, but don't grow it if your family doesn't like it. Don't plant something if you don't like the colors of it. For my husband, I can never plant pink flowers in front. He doesn't want pink flowers. I have to do white and yellow, that kind of thing. So in order to be happy, you want to plant what you want.
Yeah, for sure. And the difference between annuals and perennials, I get that question a lot too, in the course of my day. Understanding something that will need planting every year versus something that will be more foundational and just needs a little maintenance, but might go green in the wintertime and then pop back up all by itself, in the spring. So knowing the difference between those two will help you make better decisions at the shopping center too.
And be aware of how much your family can eat or how much you can give away.
Yeah.
If you went, I'm going to put 10 cherry tomato plants in, and you're harvesting 100 cherry tomatoes a day in peak season, man, that's a lot of tomatoes to try to eat or give away or find something to do. And if you miss it and they fall on the ground, if you don't clean them all up, you're going to have a bed of tomatoes next year, whether you like it or not. So it's kind of important to keep in mind how much you're really going to go through.
Or you have to learn a new hobby of canning and recipe cooking. Yeah.
Good point. Yes. Okay. So then planting your garden. So we've talked a little bit about starting from seeds, but there's definitely some value in starting from seed. There's definitely some value in going.
Nope, Diane, I think you went mute.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know what happened there. So there is a value to doing one or the other. And I thought maybe you guys could just talk about how you go through that thinking process of, am I going to start from seed or a transplant for either vegetables or annuals or perennials?
Sam, since you have the largest area that you cover, the benefits of growing from seed or starting plants, I think you could probably speak to that the best.
Yeah, no problem. So the way I go about the thought process is anything that is going to form a fruit, not anything, a lot of things, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, those types of crops, I always like to start those inside. They just seem to have a better leg up, and it's easier for them to get started in a controlled environment and then be transplanted outside. The bigger, more robust crops, watermelon, corn, sunflowers, pumpkins, and then the little green guys, your your
Cucumbers.
lettuces and cabbages and those types of things, peas, those all get direct sown right out into the gardens. Radishes, they grow quick. Um, Crop times are usually pretty short on a lot of that, other than pumpkins and watermelon. But those guys are pretty tough, and they can go directly outside, no problems at all. But the tomatoes, those types of things, they like it warm. Um, they don't like to be in the cold. I mean, we've all seen what happens when you leave them in too long, and all tomatoes shrivel up and peppers collapse. That's no fun. But the fruiting plants typically like to be started inside. A lot of those big guys, they can go directly from seed right into your garden without any issues whatsoever.
And it also depends on the number of days to maturity. If you're talking about edibles, so those of us in more northern climates would need to start things indoors if there's going to be like a 90 days to maturity kind of thing. So that's important. The other thing that I've heard people talk about is if you go to your local garden center, you go to your local mass merchant retailer, they will have plenty of transplants, but it may not be exactly what you're looking for. If you want to grow a basic beefsteak tomato or bell pepper, you can probably find a transplant. But if you're really wanting to do something different, you may need to shop for seed and start from seeds.
Yeah,
One
and
of
that's
the
where I'll say too is with flowers even, the stores are only going to be able to hold a certain amount of colors. They're gonna make decisions in November, the year before, on what they're going to order from their growers and suppliers to put in stores. So it takes 3-4 months to build up the supply of plants. So when it gets to the store and it's not the purple you're looking for, you kind of missed out on an opportunity when you could have maybe started from seed yourself in January, because the catalog of seed is so much easier to share and order online through mail order catalogs. So absolutely, you can get more personalized colors and options by starting from seed.
And the one last thing about the seed versus direct sow outside, it depends on the soil temperature as well. A lot of times you buy a seed pack and they'll tell you need soil temperatures of this range. If you're talking 65 to 70 for some things to germinate, we're not in the Midwest. We're not going to have that until June or July. So that makes a big difference too on what you could sow outside versus what you need to start inside.
And because we're talking about new gardeners today, one of the things that I thought was important is maybe starting with the easy stuff.
Yeah.
You can do a
Yes.
Google search and you can find all kinds of input on which things are easier. I actually put the picture of herbs because I know that's the first thing. I mean, I love to cook, and so I started with herbs because to me, they don't take, for the most part, they don't take near as much space and they're very easy to grow, easy to harvest. So that's always my recommendation. But there are certainly some other things too that you should choose because it is easy to start.
Yeah, they're definitely easier to start or even to maintain. So petunias, impatiens, zinnias, marigolds, starting those from seed, super easy. And even you get into some of the other, if you're transplanting and you're starting with a plant, like what should I grow that's low maintenance, still a high impact, will fill in pretty fast, make me look like a pro without too much work. I'm thinking begonias, geraniums, they bulk up. What we say that they get big really fast. So you may start with a small plants, but within a matter of weeks, if the weather can, in the springtime, Mother Nature can, contributes to that, you'll have a really large plant. And I didn't have to do anything but maybe water it once a week. And so those are the kinds of plants you want to be successful with first before you start venturing out into like orchids and, things that are, very tough to kind of like, you have to like research. Stick with those easy ones, get really good at those. And feel really successful. And then gardening after that becomes easy because you've gone through a few hits and misses. Herbs especially, I mean, they're instant gratification. I can buy that little mint and basil plant right from the store and use it the same day. And the more you cut, the more the plant's like, thanks, I'm going to shoot up more leaves for you. So it's easier to maintain and easier to use right off the bat.
And the thing that I put down here is newer varieties. So, between our organizations, your companies, we know a lot of the breeding companies. And in fact, we're going to do a big mat release on this later this month or next month about what the breeding companies are doing now and everything that they're trying to put forth with the new varieties is to make them easier, more foolproof for the home gardener. I mean, we're talking about Mother Nature and we're talking about something that's very perishable. So nothing
Living,
is going to never die, which we talk about that later in the presentation. But be looking for the newer varieties because they're going to come with some built-in disease resistance and more vigor and, you know, a higher yield if you're talking about fruits and more flowers. So that's just one of the great things about today's technology and innovations. But here, this is another important thing is planting for
oh,
pollinators, okay? And this again, we could have a full hour-long presentation on this, but
we definitely should. Yes,
and we
absolutely.
should. Well, we do. We
We
do
do. We
have
have one coming
something
up.
planned. Yeah, we do have something planned. But really, the diversity is key, and you know, planting a wide variety of crops. And don't think that you're going to have a vegetable garden if you don't have any ornamentals there to attract the pollinators. You'll be more successful if you do. Any other quick tips on this big, broad topic?
I I love it, I think it was either Sam or one of my colleagues that had said, at the end of the year when you're raking up your leaves, you can leave a few leaves, off to the side in your beds. Those are actually homes for pollinators over the winter, over the cooler season. That's where they lay eggs. That's where they hide. You cover up kind of bumblebee hives and areas like that. So we try to manicure our lives so much, and we get out the sprays and things like that. By having a more balanced ecosystem in your garden and inviting these good bugs into the garden actually helps you cut down on the times you have to attack the bad bugs. So you don't want to, no one wants to take the chemical route, to try to get rid of things. So looking for holistic ways to, increase the good bugs, and that helps eliminate the bad ones that might be coming in and eating your tomatoes, and kind of taking out some of your flowers. So I think just kind of looking at pollinators is not just ways to get more fruit for you and production. It really kind of creates a beautiful ecosystem that you actually spend less time. It works for you rather than against you.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, what we typically do is all the leaves fall down. We cut all our plants back in the fall. We rake it all out, and then in the spring we just go buy mulch.
Right.
It's like if you just leave it all there and let it decay on its own and keep those beneficial insect populations there and leave it as an overwintering site for even some small woodland creatures that are in there, it just makes it a better environment for everything that's there. You don't necessarily need to get rid of all of it. You can clean up the vegetable garden, throw it off to the side in the perennial beds, and just let them go.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we definitely need to now have two seminars or a 2 hour long just on pollinators. But it is an important topic, and we will be addressing that more in the future in a separate webinar. This one I think we kind of already talked about, suggested sowing and planting dates. We gave that planting calculator for you based on last frost date, soil temperature, and everything like that. So that one's pretty simple. Planning your garden, and I don't know if somebody mentioned this earlier, succession planting, etc. But knowing the difference between cool season and warm season crops, plant them all, plant them at different times. You guys want to add anything to that one?
One of my favorite things to do, because beans are so easy to direct sow, that means I've taken the large bean seed and put it directly into warm soil in the ground outside. I'll succession plan that every 2 weeks or so that when my first row of beans I'm harvesting from there and I'm having great dinners, within another week, and I've already kind of taken all of those from those plants, within the next week, I've got round number 2. And I'm giving round number 1 a chance to kind of come back with more flowers and more fruit. So same thing with lettuce, cut and come again. You have some areas where you can plant, then the next 2 weeks more is maturing, and you can cut those down while the next one is coming back. So you have elongated your season that way for sure.
And on the cool season and warm season crops, I mean, there are things like cauliflower, broccoli, your cole crops. They need specific weather. And I know, talking with Keith, who's one of the AAS guys down in Louisiana, he has to grow those crops in December and January because he can't grow them in the middle of summer. They just don't work. And I know a lot of beginner gardeners, they may not get that information right off the bat. So you go, oh, I'm going to grow my tomatoes and my peppers and my my cauliflower all at the same time.
No.
And the cauliflower may not be happy. So you'll think, oh, it's something I'm doing wrong or whatever. No, it's not necessarily what you're doing wrong. It's just not the right time of the year. And it's Mother Nature doing what Mother Nature does, and those plants doing what they do, and they're just not happy at that point. So understanding the difference of the seasonality between crops can make you feel more successful because you're doing things at a higher level, kind of in the right order.
Excellent
There's
point.
a picture right there of the lettuce, and you've got romaine lettuce, or if you think about like iceberg lettuce, that has to have a cooler temperature to form that head, that base.
Mhm.
While the salad mix off to the side is a little bit more like growing loose leaf lettuce,
Yeah.
kind of like already mixed bag lettuce. And those are probably easier to plant and be successful if they might have a little bit more heat tolerance, while your head lettuces, I don't think I've ever been successful with growing a head of lettuce. I've tried so many times, but it has to be right in order to form that head. Otherwise I get like little dinky leaf structures, and it's trying, but it just never comes that way. So then I realize what I'm capable of. And I say, if I want lettuce in my garden, I'm going to go with the salad mix type of lettuce than the tall romaine.
Right.
I'll buy that at the store.
Yeah,
and I'll have
yeah.
the salad mix in my garden.
Exactly. Grow what's easy. Yeah.
Right.
So now these next two slides kind of have to do with the same thing. Garden spacing. We were talking about that earlier with vining crops, etc. One of my I don't know if I call it a favorite story, but I hired a professional landscape designer. This was like 20 years ago, and he came in and he planted these shrubs. Well, I don't think he paid attention to how wide the shrubs are, because they grew into the driveway and we had to shear them back every year so they didn't scratch the car. And it's like, a professional should know better, right? So if you're hiring a professional, maybe you ask these questions. If you're doing it yourself, all the plant tags have mature plant size. And to me, on the whole make it easier kind of thing, don't plant that forsythia a foot away from the house, because you're going to have to keep trimming it.
Yep.
So, you're either going to create a lot more work for yourself, and you're not going to have the natural beauty of that plant. So pay attention to plant spacing, pay attention to mature plant size. And then kind of going along with the same thing is planning your garden. It's okay to ask for help. Don't think you have to do it all. I've definitely been there, done that. I planted something and I'm like, it just looks stupid. And somebody said, well, it's too close, or you should have planted in 3s instead of 4s, or whatever. But, there's certain things you can do yourself. There's certain things where you need a professional. So I'm tossing it back to you two. Any comments on plant spacing, plant sizes, plant design?
I would say, if I can make a pitch for watching specifically tomato plants, those could run the gamut of a small bush type container tomato that maybe needs only a stake and it's supported, to a sweet 100 tomato, which is indeterminate, which means you'll get small, gorgeously delicious cherry tomatoes, but it will take over everything in your yard. So if you're not mindful of that spacing or understanding, and you haven't given the plant its space, it will dominate, or it might struggle because it's not as large or competing with your overall design. So that was a mistake I made a couple years ago. I'm like, oh, everyone says that tomato is delicious, I'm going to grow that. And it really just took over everything, crowded out my cucumber plants even. So I didn't have any cucumbers that year because it was not getting enough light. It had plenty of sweet 100s. But then in terms of flower and arranging, plant spacing, and then the maturity and how long it will take, I think we want instant gratification. And sometimes larger shrubs, they need that third season to really come into their own. And that's when you'll see them take off. So it's a patience as well, understanding your garden, that yes, I bought it small, or I bought it and I'm spacing and it seems extreme. But if you see it in a couple seasons, it definitely fills in, and you've given it its proper spacing.
So
and
sorry, I was just going to say, it's a good time to remind everybody it's okay to make a mistake.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Keep coming to that. Go ahead, Sam.
And then there's a bit of a difference if you're planting an ornamental landscape versus an edible landscape. If there's an ornamental landscape, you might want the plant material to meld into one. If you're planting 5 or 6 shrubs all the same, you want that to look like one big mass. If your tomato plant says it's going to be 2 feet wide and you put the rows 2 feet apart, getting in between those plants to harvest, to prune, to do whatever you're going to do is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I've made this mistake in our gardens here, and I know Diane has seen it, where we put plants way too close together and it's nearly impossible to get between the rows. So if it's a 2-foot wide plant, maybe you put them 4 feet apart so you still have the opportunity. The plant,
water.
the whole thing gets light. There's the fruit is maturing all the way around. There's room to walk around,
Airflow.
work on that plant. Yes, exactly. So just be aware of the type of landscape you're planting.
Right, right. So now let's talk a little bit about hard goods, I'm not going to call it hardscapes, because Sam, again, you brought this up earlier about trellises, arches, whatever kind of support. So, you know, if you have those indeterminate tomatoes, you're going to need some support. Katie, you mentioned cucumbers, beans, peas. You can let them grow on the ground, but you might as well use the upright. They're going to be easier to harvest and they're not going to get dirty on the ground, things like that. But the other thing that I thought was very helpful to talk about is gardening doesn't have to be super, super expensive. And maybe there's just a few basic tools. You could probably find them at yard sales. You could probably get some handed down to you. But I have this divided into 2 ways. So to me, some of the most basic needs, if you're going to do just container gardening, are a good pair of gloves, or 2 or 3, because I always wear out my right hand because I'm right-handed, a trowel or a fork, a pruners or a snippers, just for pruning back some of your plants or snipping off the harvest, something like that, a watering hose or a watering can, because we know water is important for the garden. So before I go to the next slide, which is like if you're doing in beds or yard gardening, anything else that you think is ultra important, or could you do away with something like that? If you were oh, there you go. What is that called, Sam?
So it's a small hand hoe, and I use this for almost everything. You could it doesn't look rigid, but it's very, very stiff. So I use this to plant. I use it to weed. If I need to make a furrow with a ridge to plant seeds down the top of, I could do that with this as well. I've dug out beds to plant bulbs with this. So a little tool like this could take the place of several different tools. I just feel comfortable with this. It fits well in my hand. It's not super heavy either. So I like these a lot for that reason, because you don't need a separate trowel, little hand hoe. You can do everything you need with one tool. It's less to lose. It's less to carry around. For me, it makes life easier when I've got a million tools I usually need to carry around.
Yeah, and I see that somebody just posted about their Cobra Head garden tool.
Oh,
that is
yeah.
very similar to what you have there, nice rounded, and they have it in several sizes. I love that one also, kind of a all-in-one. So here's, Katie, did you have anything to add for containers?
I think one of those, it doesn't have to be super expensive, but just a foam kneeler, because most of us are probably going to be on the ground at some point, and just to protect your pants, your knees, just a nice little give as you're kneeling and pruning or planting your plants is always helpful as well. And you can get them as cheap as at the dollar store, or as, you know, rubber coated and bright and personalized as you like. But I always like having a little kind of gardening kneeler there as well.
That is Sam is showing.
Yeah, something like this guy.
Yeah. Hey, Sam, who makes that tool that you were just showing?
The company is called Bare Bones.
Bare Bones. Okay.
Yes, and it's a good company. Yeah.
And we have Corona Tools is one of our members, and they have a huge variety of tools. And clippers and snippers. Somebody just said a hori knife, wait a minute, let me go now to our yard one. Spade, rake, hoe, loppers, wheelbarrow is always good. So again, you don't need everything under the sun, but just find some good ones, some quality ones that are comfortable, you know, that have a nice grip on them. So
something sturdy. I would also recommend something with a bright handle. If you've got a darker space, or you lose it in the grass and it's green, you might run over it with the lawnmower. I've done that as well. So if it's bright pink or yellow or red, you see it on the grass. So just throwing that out there.
That's an excellent point. Yeah. I've lost my green ones before. So yeah.
I've rolled over gloves. Yeah. All those.
Oh yeah. Exactly. Okay, so what about composting? Let's talk about that. I mean, it's a way to not be throwing things into the landfill and into your trash. It has to get picked up. What if somebody wanted to start small? Any recommendations on how to start small with compost?
There are several small container compost options that even to the point where you can sit them on your counter. I still don't know if I want rotting vegetables anywhere near my kitchen. I would probably put that out in the garage or on a balcony, but you can start small. The only thing you want to consider is you don't want to put like the oils and the meats. Those are the things that cannot necessarily be composted. Technically, they can be composted, but that's what brings in rodents and creatures that will you don't want near your vegetable garden. So good bugs and worms and things like that will eat through leaf litter. They'll eat through leftover vegetables, peelings from potatoes, coffee grounds, tea bags, newspapers. Those are the kinds of easy things, eggshells you could use that will compost relatively quickly. It's just a matter of kind of a ratio between browns and greens. So browns would be your papers and your twigs, and greens would be your fresher vegetable peelings and grass clippings. And if you have a good ratio between those two, and then Mother Nature kind of you add a little soil on top and kind of keep turning a little bit, maybe go in there with your rake and turn it over every couple times, that becomes good nutrients because all of that's soaking out of the vegetable peelings and paper. And then it's also stuff that you can add back into your garden, either as a mulch over the top, or you turn it into your soil the next year. You generally, what this person right now is doing, I hope that's not an actual vegetable garden. I hope it's a compost pile. You really can't put fresh vegetables right into your garden and expect like instant results. You kind of have to do that in a separate space. So if you can devote a small little area off to the side, maybe behind your shed, that is dedicated for compost, I would recommend that. And then you grab your buckets and your wheelbarrow, and then the good stuff goes in the bucket and you add that to your garden.
I thought the same thing when I was looking at this picture. I was like, okay, I'm hoping
like
that
a
this is a
raising bed.
compost pile that she was adding additional to. Yeah. And it looks to me like there's some things that are still edible, but hey, that's what you get with stock photography, right?
Yep.
And okay, so then let's segue to this next one with some kind of notes of caution. Is it fertilizer can be your friend, but you should never overuse your fertilizer. So, there's several different types you can use. You can do the water solubles that's in your watering can or attached to your hose, or you can do the slow release in the soil when you first do it in the spring. But let's talk a little bit about not overusing fertilizer. Did we lose Sam? Is he still here?
I'm back. If you
Oh, there you are.
me.
Okay. You just disappeared from my front screen. So I'm not sure which one of you wants to talk about fertilizers.
Well, I'm gonna take a stab at this one because I'm looking at a petunia, and as one of the webmasters for the Wave Petunia brand, this plant needs some fertilizer because I can see that it's already lost several blooms. I'm seeing a few seed heads. It really wants to push up new flowers, but it's hungry. So what I would have done with this one is added water soluble fertilizer at a ratio as low as something organic, like a 3-1-1 could be just as helpful as something that's super pumped up like a 20-20-20, which Wave petunias can take. But you want to watch the dosage. So you've got a 2-gallon watering can. You want to watch and follow the dosage on the label. Don't think that like 4 pumps is good for like 1 ounce of water. That's a chance to burn your plants because it still is something it's almost like overfeeding someone at the buffet. You don't want that feeling. You want to give them a nice diet of nutrition, but you don't necessarily want to overfeed, which could then cause other problems in your plants.
Yeah.
But this is really the key when a new gardener sees an established gardener, they're like, wow, what's your secret? It really is feeding your plants because again, going back to the soil, if your soil is kind of a neutral soil, it's not overly nutritious or underly nutritious. The plant is happy for the water, but they're really hungry. A little bit of food really pushes flowers. And that's what's going to be key with something like a petunia plant or in geraniums and things like that. You start to notice the plant might go a little yellow, or in pansies, it might go purple. And you're like, what's going on? It's probably a feed issue for them.
Yeah. Okay,
And
so
there,
I'm going to, we only have a couple minutes and there's
Oh,
just a
no.
couple like really high level things, some points I want to make, and we'll see if we have a couple minutes left. But okay, gardeners are your friends, ask questions. You know,
Yes.
go to the local garden center, go to your neighbors, join a
Find
club.
your local
Gardeners,
extension office. Yes. They'll tell you what to
exactly.
plant when.
Yeah. We talked about pest earlier, but you will have bugs in your garden. If you're doing the garden right, you'll have both good and bad, but don't always assume a bug is bad. So be thinking first that there are a lot of good bugs in there. And then the next thing is plants do die. You know, sometimes it's just Mother Nature. Sometimes some hail comes through. Sometimes a dog sits on it. You will lose some plants. So don't think it's you. Just try again, you know, next year. Weeds don't die typically, you know, somehow Mother Nature is outsmarting us. And some people say there's not really weeds. These are dandelions. Okay, they're great for bees. So just understand all the different diverse plants that you're going to have. And one of the things that I think a judge said is a gardener's best tip or best friend is their shadow. So it means being out there and paying attention. And maybe, in fact, somebody had asked a question about their raised beds had never been planted and were covered with weeds. Well, you stay on top of it. You know, you have to get out there. And if you see a weed, pull it up. You know what you've planted and what you didn't plant. If you didn't plant it, more than likely, it's not something you want. Plant labels, I think, are very, very important. If you love something and you want to plant it again, you got to remember what it is. And if you're like me, a month later, you're not going to remember the specific variety. So label your plants, or keep a journal, which I think I have later. Don't be afraid to prune. You know, I think we've all seen some of the overgrown houses in the neighborhood, and it lowers your property value, and it's a security issue. It's not good for your house. Deadhead some of your plants, you'll get more flowers out of them. Let's see here. Don't be afraid to harvest. Also, right? I mean, you'll get more yield if you have more plants. I mean, if you'll have more yield if you harvest them is one thing. Don't be afraid to eat some tomatoes if they're a little ugly. There's that company called Ugly Produce for a reason, because not everything that grows in your garden looks perfect. It may taste better than the perfect looking ones, right? One other thing is about plants are movable, and obviously that's more for perennials, but my neighbor is the queen of moving her perennials around. And, you know, it took me a couple years to go, wow, she's doing a great job and they look better here. And then I think one of the last things I mentioned, a journal. I think these are very, very valuable, is to keep track. That way, if you were successful or not successful, you can look back at your journal and say, I do or I do not want to grow that one again. So we have 2 minutes left, but there were some questions we did not get to. So what I want to do is I'm going to save the chat, and I will do a follow-up email, and I'll get some input from Sam and Katie on some of these questions. I know there were a lot more about compost, a lot more about pollinators, a lot more about soil. We will answer those in a follow-up email for you. But Katie and Sam, any closing thoughts? I mean, what would be your words to somebody who says, I want to start gardening this year? What would be your overall advice?
I just want to say you have my permission to kill plants. You know, like it's okay to just give it a try. And every missed opportunity, you know, is a chance to grow and literally grow something else. And I think that's the key to take away as a beginners. Don't stop just because you've had a couple fails. There's a gardener in everybody, and really once it gets in, it becomes part of your lifeblood, and there's so many benefits to it, beyond just having more tomatoes on your counter or a pretty flower to give, you know, in a vase. It's so many internal health benefits to gardening and enjoying nature.
yeah, and I absolutely agree with what Katie just said. Gardening is supposed to be fun. You try new things. I mean, I kill thousands of plants every year, but we plant like 100,000, so you can't really tell. But there's a lot of them out there that don't make it. There are designs I do that I cannot stand, and I make a note of it. It's like, well, I'm never doing that again. That did not work at all. I do it constantly. I've been doing it for 20 years in a professional environment, and I get paid for it. I still make those mistakes. But there are crops that I never would have realized I liked if they hadn't been in AAS trials and we hadn't tried them here. Kohlrabi, which is super fun and interesting to grow and be fun for kids. Things like fennel, which I never would have grown, but they're very interesting. So just try new things and have fun with it. You usually could find somebody you work with or a neighbor that really likes whatever you grew, even if you don't enjoy it. But hey, give it a shot, have fun. That's what the variety is the spice of life, right? Just go for it and enjoy it.
Yes, great tips. That's what a lot of our judges have said is try something new. You never know. So I do encourage everybody to go to our website, ngb.org, under education. You can see some additional webinars that we're going to give this year. Plus there's recordings from all the ones last year. This one has been recorded and we'll post that onto our website. So I really want to thank everybody for attending, especially Katie and Sam for being our panelists, Gail for posting all the links in our chat. This has been a wonderful hour. Somebody said, hey, we could have used 2 hours, and you're absolutely right, we could have.
Always.
But we'll have additional topics soon, and we look forward to welcoming everybody to the next webinar that you choose to attend or be a panelist on. So thank you so much and have a great day.